Hi, my name is Dr. Abdul Manan. I'm a GP. I'm a medical director at Blue Peanut Medical Education. I want to talk to you today about why people fail the UCAT test. As you can understand, thousands of students sit this test every year in the UK in applying for a medical school place or a dental school place. So why do so many people sit this test and unfortunately fail, or rather get an undesirable mark? Well, as you know, there isn't a pass and fail mark as such, but I'm sure you're well aware that there is a cut-off. Some universities want a certain mark, some people will rank you in certain percentages or deciles, for example, and depending on that, you may or may not get an offer for interview at that medical and dental school, or worst case scenario, you don't get any offers at all. So let's look at why people fail this test. First of all, wrong timing, right? What I mean by that is you have to acknowledge that you've only got one attempt at sitting this test in any given year. If for whatever reason you don't get into your chosen medical school or dental school and you have to apply again the following year, you will have to resit the UCAT test. So therefore, we got one chance and we need to do it properly, okay? Number two, don't forget there is a burden of finance involved. You have to pay for this. So if you're having to pay, then it's cost issues coming in. Also, there's a booking thing, right? You need to book this test early in June, as early as possible if you're going to sit it that year. Some mistake we make is that we leave things too long. We want to do some revision or wait for the summer exams to finish. We leave it too late, and then what we have is we can't book at our chosen centres. Their dates aren't available, and worst case scenario, there's no dates left, or not as bad, but there isn't a space nearby and you have to travel to a place further afield. That might mean travel the night before, that might mean hours of travel on the day. So it's not the most ideal situation to be in when you've got quite a challenging test to face later on. Another thing we would say is that people, when they do book the test, they are attempting the sit too early. So for example, students come to us and say the test is early August, for example, but they've only revised for a couple of weeks. They've not had time to understand the test, revise appropriately, and sit at the right time. So we would suggest that you think about booking towards the end of August, possibly early to mid-September if you can do that, and that will give you decent amount of time over the summer holiday to revise, and it gives you an ordered, organized approach to revision. That in itself is something to think about, is that you need to have a plan so that you revise well for this test. So another reason might be insufficient preparation. So the number of times we come across our students at our courses, those that email us and contact us for advice, we find that people aren't preparing well. And that means that they're either leaving very little time for revision between the time of booking and time to sit the test, which means there's very little time, therefore they will cram. This isn't one of those tests that you can cram. You need to prepare given enough time so that you do moderate amounts of revision, and that could be 1, 2, 3 hours a day, depending on your circumstances, of course. And you need to do that regularly in a structured way. The revision sessions need to be broken down in small 20-minute chunks so that you can learn it effectively, absorb what you've learned, build in breaks, build in time for reflection and analysis of areas that you're struggling with. And then cumulatively over the week, we need to cover all sections in a uniform way and allow time to focus also on sections where you might be weak, sections where you might not be so sure about. You might want to redo questions, you might want to discuss with your peers, you might want to discuss with people like ourselves for advice and so forth. So this needs to be done on a consistent basis, small but regular opportunities over several weeks. We normally advise between 8 and 10 weeks to allow for adequate revision. So the third reason might be doing lots of questions. Does doing lots of questions translate to being good at the test itself? Do you score highly at the test itself? Well, you may be surprised to learn that actually doing lots of questions doesn't necessarily turn out to be a positive result, at the test itself. Rather, what we suggest is that not all question sources are calibrated, certainly to the standard of UCAT questions. So therefore, you mustn't be over-reliant or become overconfident, having done well at a certain question source, a certain question bank, or a certain book that you've done. Instead, what we suggest is that you build into your revision method, doing questions in an organized way, so that you're able to reflect, you're able to come back to questions that you're not so good at, and be able to understand why you're not so good at those particular type of questions. Troubleshoot, make sure you improve in those weaker areas. And that way you'll find that cumulatively you'll improve how you do on questions overall. I don't have any specific data as such on specific UCAT banks, but what I can suggest is that doing different sources does help, because what I find is certain UCAT question banks are stronger in certain areas than others. So say, for example, you revise from 2 or 3 different sources, there's more chance that you'll calibrate yourself better, in the sense that some UCAT banks are stronger in certain sections, other UCAT banks are stronger in other sections. So I do find certain question banks, question books are better at, for example, verbal reasoning and decision making. Others are a lot more stronger on absolute reasoning and quantitative, for example. So that's something I think is quite important to keep in mind. Now, in terms of weaker areas, now there is theory where people will focus on their areas of strength, and that in itself may create a false sense of security. So a student who is weaker on verbal reasoning, for example, I think the trick is that early on we identify that that is a weaker area. What we're going to do, we're going to, as part of our revision strategy, is we're going to focus on that area on a regular basis, so that build that up. We build that up so it's as good as other areas where we are strong at. So the next issue is poor technique. So this is about not finishing the exam on time, not doing the questions properly, not reading them properly. There's only so many question types that can come up in your test. Many are well known and have certain strategies for dealing with them. We talk about them in our courses quite often with our students, and it's not easy to articulate and learn them easily over books, but through discussions, through looking at examples, what we find is that certain questions like situational judgment, there's ways you can approach them. There are rules that you can adhere to, for example, eliminate wrong answers. In decision making, we find that students get confused over wording, dealing with negative sentences, for example, making false assumptions. In verbal reasoning, we find that people, when presented with huge amounts of information, you're struggling for time to read, and a lot of time is wasted that way. People don't have enough time to answer the question, and as a result lose vital seconds and minutes, and therefore questions are left unanswered or wrong answers are put in. Remember, the exam is on the computer as well, so it's vital to know how the computer system works, how, for example, the calculator on the screen, knowing the functions and how to work it, knowing how to flag questions, coming back to questions where you've not been able to answer it in the first time. So these things. So it's about getting used to the computer system as well. Eliminating incorrect answers and improving your chances of getting to the right answer. What about exam technique? Exam technique as well is very important, even from the day before, ensuring that, making sure that you prepare well from the day before. And that includes like eating well, it includes sleeping well, it includes getting your documents right so that you turn up on the day with the right documents. You won't believe the number of times people contact us and say, oh, I forgot my photo ID, for example, or I got a letter from my college but it was worded wrong, or I was too tired, I couldn't think. So it's so important about making sure you're well hydrated, making sure you eat the right things in the morning before the actual exam, making sure you travel the night before or travel early so that you're not turning up late. All of these kind of add to how you might manage yourself, your nerves on the day. So all this is really important in my view. Another problem I come across, and I feel bad about this, is people having, I would say, kind of a more laissez-faire attitude towards the UCAT test. Remember, it's only one sitting you have in that given year. You don't have the luxury of saying, I'll just, I'll give it a go and I'll see how I get on. There's no such thing as winging the UCAT test. You can't. You have to pay it the due respect and prepare adequately. So I haven't got a clue why you would do that, because so much rests on the result of your UCAT test. These days more so than in the past, where UCAT is used as a discriminating factor between interviewing somebody, between offering them a space, a place at the university. It's so important to get it right. For all I know, you may get lucky and get a great mark, but I think you'll get caught out now these days when the UCAT mark is so important, and also the actual mark itself being quite high and competitive. So just beware of that. You will get to know your UCAT score before you submit your application. And so depending on what score you get, it's important to kind of look at that and think carefully about what you do next. So for example, if you felt you'd get an X amount as a score, but you haven't, you've got a lower score, have a think whether those particular universities you've applied to will now look at your application. Because if you fall below certain thresholds, you may not even get an offer for interview, let alone offer for a place. So therefore, applying to another university where you have more of a chance to get to interview is probably more advisable. There are other students we talk to who, I've got the BMAT coming up. Remember, the BMATs are not going to be around for long. We also find that if you do well in the UCAT, you'll do better in your BMAT. So remember, one is symbiotic with the other. It helps the other. It's used by various medical schools like Oxbridge and other medical schools like some in London and spread throughout the country at the moment. So students who are looking at this at the moment, doing the BMAT, again, it probably pays dividends to prepare and do well at your UCAT test as well. Okay, so one or two other things I need to talk to you about, and that is students who aren't so well. Concentrating for several hours, it might be difficult at the best time. So if you're unwell, it's even worse, isn't it? It's even more difficult. So it's important that you sit the exam only when you're well, right? On the day, it's going to be a lot of time pressure. It's a lot of questions to do. So if you don't feel well, speak to somebody about how you're feeling in your college or your school, so that there is some kind of a record that you spoke to somebody. Contact the UCAT consortium as well and get some advice from them. It might be that they offer you to sit at another date. It might be that they give you some other facilities because you weren't feeling so well. Remember as well, if you have conditions like dyslexia, for example, the UCAT consortium allows you certain facilities. If you have dyslexia, if you have other learning disabilities, or you've got autism, for example, you'll be entitled to facilities like extra time, like having breaks, for example, like having quieter rooms, sitting in a room on your own, for example, having more space around you. And these facilities can prove critical for a candidate with these needs.